Hello and welcome back to this video. So today we're going to take a closer look at Spring Batch. But without further ado, let's dive in. So as always, let's start with some basics. So Spring Batch is a framework for batch processing. That's obvious. So if we want to load and store a lot of data, then we would use Spring Batch. So in contrast to a service, which is basically doing synchronous calls, so request response, Spring Batch is mostly async, and it's based on the concept of having reader, a processor, and a writer. So reader can be basically everything. It can be a CSV file, it can be a database, it can be REST, it can even be a message broker. So this is where we read the data. We then process the data. This can be as easy as doing nothing and just giving the data away. And then we will write the data. And this again can be a file, this can be a database, or this can be a REST call. And we can combine everything with everything because the system is very pluggable, and that's very, very nice. One step deeper, if we take a closer look, so Spring Batch has the concept of a so-called job launcher. The job launcher launches jobs, and then we have so-called steps, and the steps, these are the ones that relate to the reader, the processor, and the writer. And everything is stored in a so-called job processor, but we will see this in a moment. To get Spring Batch started, of course, we need Spring Boot, and then we just need one dependency, which is Spring Boot Starter Batch, and that's mostly it, what we need. This is my application. I will start my application. Yet there is not much we can see that without any explanation. So application compiles, application starts, and we see a lot that's going on here in the background. So what we will see later is that we have 3 jobs here. We have a so-called toy job that's reading data from a file. And then we have 2 things like a person and address job that is reading data from the database. So let's take a closer look here, what's going on. So the first thing that we need to do is our job launcher. Our job launcher is taking care that the jobs, so toy, person, address, are being launched. This thing has a run method, and it will basically just do job launcher run, and the injected jobs will be run. There is also the option that to pass in so-called parameters, so-called job parameters. They will be constructed here. So we have one example here. We just pass in the so-called catalog version to this job. For the other 2 jobs, we will just pass in an empty object. This is one option. We can just launch the application and run. There is also another option that is implemented manually. We can also have a scheduler. So if scheduler is not enabled, the application will just start. If the scheduler is enabled, we will run into this add scheduled annotation, and then it will repeatedly execute the jobs. So this depends on your use case. Sometimes you only have the part to read data, import, and then the application should terminate. And often you also have the use case of having a scheduler. That's basically when you're synchronizing data, for example, from one database to the other. You can do everything with Spring just by plugging in things together. You could even have a Tomcat in here, so a web application additionally on top of Spring Batch. That's also possible because Spring Boot and Spring Framework is very pluggable. So this is our job launcher. Now let's go one step deeper. Let's take a closer look at our toy job. Our toy job has a configuration class that has a bean that creates the job, which is basically just the outer hull of the complete job. We have the step. So remember from the graphics that we also need a step. That's one step. We can also have multiple steps. And the step then needs to be configured with the reader, a processor, and a writer. So what's very important to stress, Spring Batch is very, very flexible. While you can have a separate class for the reader, the processor, and the writer, you can also have everything just in one configuration class, or you can mix and match. So what we have here is we have a reader, which is a so-called flat file item reader, which is basically reading CSV data from here. So this is my toy catalog. So we have some toys from Toy Story here. So here we don't have a separate class, but it would be possible. We have a processor, which is a separate class, which only has one method, which is called process, but this will not do a lot. So it will get the toy, it will pass in the catalog version we saw earlier, and then it will basically reconstruct the whole object again with the same data. So we just have the builder here, and it will take the data from the input and create a new toy for the output that mostly looks the same with the exception of the catalog version. And then we need a writer. For the writer, we have a so-called JDBC batch item writer, which will write the data to the database. Again, this can be a separate class. This can also be something inside your configuration. So the writer is here. The writer needs a statement, an insert statement to work that we have to write by our own. But most of the stuff is then taken care of Spring Batch. It's even doing batch processing of the JDBC. So it's doing JDBC batch processing that has nothing to do with the outer batch processing. That's basically means that it does JDBC calls in a batch with so-called chunks. That's a performance optimization we have. Okay, that's our toy. So we have, again, we have file for the reader, item reader is file. We have a processor and we have a writer, and this will read the data from here and write it to the database. What we can also do is something different. We can also read data from the database and not a file. So this is my person anonymizer here. So as an item reader, we now pass in a data source. We pass in a so-called bean row mapper, which basically does the mapping for ourselves. It needs a select statement to read the data from the database. And that's it. Everything else is very similar. We again have a processor here and we have a writer. In this case, the writer is not inserting the data, but updating the data because as the name applies, that's an anonymizer. So what it's basically doing, it's reading the data from the database. So we have some data here, Homer Simpson, Bart Simpson, Monty Burns, reads in, then the processor gets kicked in. This processor here, it will basically use a so-called faker here, which is an external library, and it will then overwrite the first name and the last name of so-called fake objects. And then the writer goes to the database. It's mostly the same that we have with the toy here. And this also works, and it's very nice that it's very pluggable because, as we saw, we can have an item reader that reads files, but we can also have an item reader that reads data from the database. And last but not least, we also have something for the address. Again, address anonymizer configuration. As we see here, this is only one class because there is no processor and writer here directly. That's now all inside the configuration. As I told earlier, that's also possible. So our item reader is, again, just the JDBC cursor item reader as we had in our person item reader. So reading data from the database. It has a processor that's now an inner class here that's producing fake data. So this is done manually because the faker is not working at this point. And we have a writer again that's updating the data inside the database. And if we start, we will see that it's actually working. Oh, I have to clean. And then we can execute and see that it's working. Okay, finished. So we see all the jobs here. So we have our toy job that's reading the data from the database and then saying, hey, I'm writing here Buzz Lightyear. So basically what we have from our CSV file here. We have our person job that's anonymizing the data, which is here. We see here that it's anonymizing the first name and the last name. And we have our address job here that is not putting out a lot of logs here because the logs are inside the writer for the other things, and the address writer does not have logging. That's mostly it. There is one more class, which is the so-called job completion listener that you see at the end, that just says jobs are finished, or if there is an error, it will give you the error. So let's now take one closer look at the database so that we can actually see the data. So if I do a select from my toy catalog here, I see, yeah, the catalog data from this file were imported correctly. We can also take a look at the person table where we wanted to read and anonymize the data. And we see, yeah, we have anonymized data here. And of course, we can also do the same for the address, where we have the strings here, fake street and fake city. So this worked. What we also have in Spring Batch, which is very important, is we have some kind of operational tables. So we have these things which start with batch job. So we have, for example, batch job instance that give away all the jobs, but we also have batch job execution, which give us a status about the execution. So we see here, we have completed status here. If there would be an error or if we would have a warning like this, the execution table will give us all the information we need. And this is something we could later use for operation of our batch application. Let's also take a look at some of our migration scripts here. So what we are using here is Flyway. There is one important thing to notice. If you're already using something like Flyway or Liquibase, there are some things that you need to take care of. So first and foremost, you need to have this SQL files that you get from the documentation by Spring Batch, which will create all the tables needed for Spring Batch. You don't have to do this. Usually Spring Batch will then automatically create a table, but if you have a tool like Flyway will become very mad because suddenly something else outside of the Flyway scope is generating a database, and then you might get an error. So it's a good idea if you're using Flyway that one of your scripts is this batch creation. This is something you can just copy. Then, of course, we have our DDL file for the toy catalog and for the person catalog, which is not used anymore, that I can delete, by the way. Our DDL file for the person and also the demo data, and our DDL file for the address. Okay, and what we also see here is this funny create schema if not exists. So why is that? That's also because of Flyway, because if we are using Flyway, Flyway has the tendency to put all of its metadata inside the public schema. And what you usually want to have is your batch application separated from everything else from the database, so that your normal database and the batch application do not interfere. However, what you need to do is multiple things. You need first to have a separate schema. My schema is here, master data. Then you have to say table prefix, master data batch underscore for the batch tables that we saw here. Then we need to say initialize schema never, so that we tell Spring Batch not to create the tables itself. And we also need to tell Flyway, please store your data inside a separate schema and not the public schemas. You see here the comments here. And only the combination of all of this works that our batch application works scoped inside this schema. However, Flyway will try to create the schema if it's not existent. And the fun part is there is a difference if you're running inside an H2 database or running inside a Postgres database. So there seems to be a difference here. And this is why we have the if not exists master data. So a lot of babbling, but in case you want to scope your batch application and process inside a separate schema, these are the steps you need to take care of. Activate Flyway, have the script being read in as a Flyway script, have the create schema if not exists, so that it works with H2 and with the Postgres database, and also have these flags: initialize schema never, the table prefix, and then give Flyway the default schema. Please also keep in mind this means that Flyway needs to have access to a user that can create schemas. Maybe you have a user that is not able to do this. Okay, but that's mostly it. Okay, that's already it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!